have traveled so far, I have waited so long, I have almost given up. I have learned to be strong. Through it all I have hope. There is more ahead of me, and in the arms of love I'll find where I'm meant to be. Oh, oh. What if I find home when I'm with you? A place where dreams come true. When the sun ain't shining, the light will still come through the windows of the home when I'm with you.
Every year, on the second Sunday in November, I vacate the pulpit and I allow my wife to come and preach, and that has been how it has been since I've entered the pastorate. In case you're not familiar, the second Sunday in November is designated as Orphan Sunday. Both of us have a heart for these kids, these vulnerable ones. And it's not just our desire to help them. It's our desire that the fire that burns within us, the desire to help them would catch. That the people that we come in contact with in our church and in the community would catch that same flame and that same burning passion to help these kids. Because every year we hear the stories. Every year we hear stories of kids who are sent home from school with backpacks full of food because school is the only place that they get to eat. We hear stories of older children who are raising their siblings because their parents are too busy doing drugs. We hear stories of children who are beaten and who are abused by those who are supposed to be protecting them. And these stories are hard to hear. We don't like to hear them. We want to close our eyes and forget that they happen. We want to just live in our little church bubble, coming to church and having our meals together and pretending that all those things don't go on. But we can't do that. Paul tells the church in Ephesus, don't participate in the fruitless works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what is done by them in secret. Everything exposed by the light is made visible, for what makes everything visible is light. Therefore it is said, get up, sleeper, and rise up from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Pay careful attention then to how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time, because the days are evil. So don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. We must not turn a blind eye to the things that are going on in our community. These shameful things that are done in secret, they may be hard to hear. We may want to shy away from the stories when we hear them, but as hard as it is for us to hear these stories, imagine how hard it is for those living through them, those who can't pretend that they don't go on. And this is the reason that I have and I will continue to push for Orphan Sunday. As Paul said, we must understand the Lord's will in this. And God has not hidden it. He has made it abundantly clear throughout Scripture. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, for the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awe-inspiring God, showing no partiality and taking no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow. Psalm 68, Father of orphans and defender of widows is God in his holy habitation. And one that we hear often, James 1:27, true devotion, true religion is this, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, to care for the orphans and the widows in their distress. The call to the church is clear. God's heart on this matter is abundantly clear. It has been plainly revealed, and that has not gone unnoticed by the church. In fact, going all the way back to Acts chapter 6, we see organized efforts within the church to provide food for the widows in need. But even looking outside of the biblical text, back in ancient Rome, in the early church, Christians were taking in abandoned children. There was an ancient Roman practice in which when a child was born, it would be laid at the feet of the father. The father then would examine the child and determine if he wanted it, if there was something wrong, if it had a deformity, if something looked off, if it wasn't the gender that he wanted, he simply refused the child. At which point the child was taken outside of the city to be left for dead by wild animals or the elements. And in those days, it was the Christians, knowing the heart and the will of God, who would go to these places and they would rescue these babies. They would bring them into their homes and they would adopt them. It was the Christians who pressured the government to change this practice. Since the very foundation, the church has been on the front lines of this battle. But today, I don't know that we're doing all that we can or should be doing. To my knowledge, we are the only church in our community that dedicates an entire service to Orphan Sunday. I have heard stories of people who have gone to their pastor months in advance asking for just a couple minutes to share their heart about Orphan Sunday, only be told that there's not time in the service to do it. We could look at the leadership and say, well, it's a leadership problem. These leaders, these pastors, they're not in tune with God's heart. They're not in tune with God's calling. But I think it goes deeper. Outside of the leadership of the church, God's heart for the vulnerable is not widely shared. I mean, we'll say that it is. We know what we should do. In our Answers Bible study this past Wednesday, we discussed priorities. We discussed how we make time for what's important to us. In fact, if you want to be able to tell somebody's priorities, just look at how they spend their time. We looked at Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 14 of the grand banquet. In this parable, the master invites many people to come to this grand banquet that he is holding, that he has prepared just for them in his abundance. When the time is right, he sends out his servant and says, "Come, join with me." But each and every one of them makes an excuse. The first one tells him, "I have bought a field and I must go out and see it. I ask you to excuse me." The second one replies, "I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm going to try them out. I ask you to excuse me." The third one tells him, "I just got married and therefore I'm unable to come." Each one had an excuse. Each one had other priorities. They had their own possessions. They had to play with their new toys. Each one had a higher priority. They had something else that they would rather be doing. It's not a matter of not knowing God's heart. We know God's heart. We know God's calling. And we feel it. When we see the faces on TV, when we hear the statistics that were shared last week of all the children who are in need of a home, many who will age out of a system with no clear direction or family. We hear it all, and it breaks our hearts. But we choose to ignore it. We choose to do nothing. We make excuses, saying, well, yes, but. We explain away the responsibility. Well, my house isn't big enough. I couldn't possibly take in any kids. My life is just too busy. You know, with work and all my other activities, I don't have time. Or we put it off. And we say, well, after my life slows down, when things aren't quite so crazy, when my kids are older, when I'm more secure, when I'm more established, then I will help. We pass on the banquet. We set aside what we know to be the heart of God. And why do we do it? We have many reasons, but I think when it all comes down to it, we're scared. We're scared what it means. We're scared what will change, how our lives will change if we begin to give time and energy and our resources. We're scared that what if I'm not good enough? What if I mess things up? What if I can't do it? What about my family? How is it going to affect my marriage? How is it going to affect my kids? We come up with all these what ifs, all these excuses. And each and every one of them comes from a place of fear. Fear that God won't stand with us. Fear that God won't provide for us the resources, the emotional support, the training, whatever it may be. We are afraid that God won't be there when things get tough. We fear that God won't guide us, that God won't help us. But that's been the fear ever since the beginning. That's the same fear that a young Timothy was feeling as he was trying to lead and guide a church. And so his mentor, Paul, reminded him, and I'm reminding you, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and sound judgment. We as the church are called to reach into the darkest corners of our community, to help the vulnerable. We have been called to span the gap between the dark deeds that are done in secret and God's heart for the lost and the vulnerable. God is calling us to step out in faith, to trust Him, to provide all that we need, to trust Him when He promises His abundance, to trust Him to squelch our fears, and to follow His heart, to follow Him without excuses, to enjoy all that He has prepared for us. And will it get messy? Absolutely. Jesus' ministry was messy. And it has had a lasting impact to this very day. The hard truth is, you can't help everyone. But you can help someone. We heard the statistics last week, and they can be overwhelming. To hear of the great need, even just within our state. But don't focus on what you can't do. Focus upon what you can do. Maybe you don't have room in your house to take in 5 extra kids. But if you added bunk beds, do you think you could squeeze in just one more? Maybe you don't know where to begin. But do you know a parent who is struggling, who doesn't know what to do with their kids, that could benefit from someone coming alongside of them, sharing their love and experience? This picture hangs in our hallway. And all those little dots on it are fingerprints. Fingerprints of children that have been impacted because we have chosen to help. Because we have refused to make excuses. And as you look at that, it may look like a lot. There's a lot more room to grow, but there are a good number of fingerprints on there. But the truth is, 4 years ago, it was empty. But day by day, child by child, it has grown. The magnitude of the need can be overwhelming. We can be paralyzed by our fear, but that fear does not come from God. It's not a matter of helping all of them. It's a matter of helping all that you can. Help one. Because we know that God's heart is to help the widows and the orphan, the vulnerable and the lost, to care for those who are oppressed. You can't read a few pages in Scripture without finding some reference to that. God's call is to follow Him. God's call is to put Him and His desires and His heart as the top priority in your life. God's call is to join Him. His call is to not make excuses, but to partake in the abundance of the banquet He has prepared.